Good morning. Welcome to this first edition of the Austin channel of YouTube Live. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a crazy few months since we were last together. This is probably the first time that you've seen me since February, and I'm certainly looking forward to the day where I can see all of you again. And that day will certainly come, and we'll all be it'll be great to be able to hug one another and shake hands again. Hopefully that day will certainly come and allow us to do that. So we do have some announcements today before we get to our main presentation. We're so thankful for J. Warner Wallace to join us today, but I would like to go through a couple of announcements and let you see how we're going to be moving forward at this point. So first of all, I would also like to send out a thank you to Worldview Media, who's putting this together for us. So we've had to be very flexible in putting this together. And we thought we were going to be live with Jim here in person just as little as a couple of weeks ago. But obviously with the way the pandemic has unfolded, we've had to change things. But I'd like to say a big thank you to Jorge and Diego with Worldview Media. Jorge is in South Carolina and Diego is in Costa Rica. And we have Jim in California and myself in Georgetown, Texas. So it's amazing that we have the technology to put something like this together today live. And so I certainly want everybody to appreciate that they do this for a lot of Christian apologetic ministries. And if you like what you see here, I would certainly encourage you to reach out to them and see how they can help you in your chapter or your ministry if you have come by this broadcast. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how we're going to move forward. I want to make sure that everybody knows to visit the website in order to see our future schedule. So if you go to the main Reasons to Believe website, which is reasons.org, you'll see that there's a place there on the menu that's called Get Involved. And so you should click on Get Involved. And when it does, it'll take you to that web page. And from there, you'll scroll down until you see the RTB chapter icon. And so there, click on the RTB chapters, and that'll take you to the chapters website where you will scroll down, and then you will find the Austin, Texas chapter. When you click on that, it'll take you to our individual Austin, Texas chapter page. Once again, you'll want to scroll down and you'll go to the Google Calendar. Within the Google Calendar, you'll click on the month that you want to see. For instance, we'll click on July, and that'll open up the page and it'll show the link to the YouTube Live channel. Below that, you'll see the email address where you can send in questions for the Q&A that will follow. These will be live questions and answers. And then as you scroll down below that, you'll see the title of the presentation. You'll see the presenter. You'll have a one-paragraph promo of the presentation, and then you'll also have a bio of the presenter. So I would encourage you to visit our website and stay informed and keep your calendar current in regard to future presentations. And we are extremely excited about other presentations that we have coming in the future. So next month, we have Dr. Robert Marks from Baylor University who's going to be presenting. Dr. Marks is a professor in their Department of Engineering and Computer Technology, and he's plugged into the artificial intelligence community. So his presentation is going to be titled Human Exceptionalism, Things That We Do That Artificial Intelligence Never Will. And he's going to look at the question, can humans duplicate humans using artificial intelligence? And so he's going to provide evidence that the answer is no, not now, and not ever. And I'm very much looking forward to this presentation. I've read a lot of the distinguished philosopher of the mind, John Searle, and I believe that his Chinese thought experiment is used to give the same answer that Dr. Marks is going to be providing us. And so I'm very much looking forward to him coming to present. And then in September, we're going to have Dr. Sarah Salbiander back. And we love to have Sarah. She's probably our most popular presenter that comes on an annual basis. Like our speaker today, she's a former atheist that the evidence led her to become a theist and eventually a Christian. And she's going to be taking a look at Genesis 1. And the title is, How Should We Look at Genesis 1? And she's going to be looking at two different perspectives. One is the ancient and supernatural perspective, and then she'll also look at the modern and the material perspective. And so she has been doing a lot of reading in this regard, and she's very excited to actually talk about this. And we love it when we have presenters that are excited about their subject. So we'll be looking forward to having her in September. And we're actually going to try and have a combo meeting. So we will be broadcasting it live on our YouTube live channel, but we're also going to have some people live and in person, governmental regulations permitting. So in September, those who are 60 or older, we're going to encourage you to stay home and watch it on YouTube Live, because as we have all learned, the mortality rate for those that are older is much higher. But if you're younger and you would like to come and attend, and we are encouraging everyone to wear a mask, then we'll be presenting this from the Ministry Center of Main Street Baptist Church in Georgetown. Main Street's Ministry Center will seat probably a good 400 people or so. There's plenty of room to space out. I would imagine we won't have more than 30 or 40 or so in attendance. And so people will be invited live. And Dr. Salviander would like to have people live and in person. And if you've ever talked publicly, it's a lot easier if you have people to talk to and give you some feedback. So again, regulations permitting, we're going to try and have a combo meeting in September on our second Saturday, which is our normal meeting time. And then finally, in October, I'm going to be giving my presentation again titled The Theology of String Theory. And we're going to be looking at the biblical implications of extradimensionality. Now, I've given this presentation a few times in various venues, and I have received a lot of feedback from people asking me if this was ever recorded, and it had not been to this point. So I've decided this would be a good time to give it and to record it. Because I've had people who have been in church all of their life, who have gone to Sunday school all of their life, who've read the Bible through several times, and they have told me how eye-opening and thought-provoking the concepts are that we discuss when we talk about the extra dimensionality that sheds some light on some of these biblical paradoxes that we all struggle with. So this is going to be the third Saturday in October. We have a scheduling conflict for the second Saturday, our normal meeting time. So again, it'll be the third Saturday, October the 17th. And I also would highly recommend that if you can take the time to watch the PBS Nova series, The Elegant Universe, hosted by Brian Greene, the physicist Brian Greene. This is my all-time favorite science documentary. And it's a 3-part series. Each part is 1 hour long, so it's 3 hours total. You can get this through Netflix. You can check it out from the library. You, I think, can see it online. You can go to the PBS website and view it online. And if you have DVDs in your library, I have several copies. If you have any science documentaries, you should have this one. It's an excellent documentary, but it will provide some foundational knowledge that will help you in grasping some of the theoretical concepts that we'll be discussing. So again, that'll be October the 17th. Now, today we're going to have questions and answers after J. Warner Wallace's presentation. So I would encourage you to write down our email address for those questions, and it's reasonstb Austin, reasons to believe Austin. So it's reasonstbaustin@yahoo.com. Please send in your questions. Please keep them as short and concise as possible so it would be easier for us to read them and to get them on the air so that Jim can answer those. So we are just over the moon excited to have J. Warner Wallace to be speaking with us in our chapter meeting. Again, originally we were hoping that he was going to be here in Austin. Things haven't worked out that way, but we were able to partner with Gateway Church here in Austin to try and bring him here. And so I wanted everyone to know that he is going to be speaking at Gateway Church tomorrow. I would encourage you to go to their website and see what the times for their broadcast is going to be. It will be a virtual presentation, just like he's doing today. But tomorrow he's going to be talking about the evidence on behalf of the resurrection. I'm sure that he's going to be presenting a lot of the evidence that's contained in his book, Cold Case Christianity. And so, again, I would encourage you to go to the Gateway Church, I believe it's gatewaychurch.com website, to see those times. So I read J. Warner Wallace's book, Cold Case Christianity, and just absolutely loved it. And then a little over a year ago, I started reading the book, God's Crime Scene. And at the beginning of the book, I noticed that Dr. Sarah Salviander had written a promotional blurb for the book. And I thought, well, that's great for you, Sarah. And then I noticed in the acknowledgments that Jim had also thanked her for her contributions to that book. And it got me to thinking, well, I wonder how close Sarah is. And so I reached out to Sarah and I asked her, I said, I was reading J. Warner Wallace's book and I noticed he had thanked you for your assistance in the book, and just wondering how close you are and if you maybe can help get Jim to Austin. And she said, well, yeah, she considered Jim to be a very good friend. Now, I don't know if they've ever loaned each other money or anything like that, a true friendship. But she said that, yes, that they have communicated and she would be more than happy to reach out. And fortunately, through her efforts and also with Gateway Church helping to partner with us, we were able to get Jim to agree to speak to our Austin chapter. And so we are so thankful to have J. Warner Wallace here. If you don't know, he is a former atheist. I believe that he's a former cold case detective. I don't know that he's still active or participates in it. He might talk a little bit about that. I continue to see him on many of the criminal investigation shows that I like to watch. And so maybe he can comment on whether he still does any of that or not. But please join me in welcoming J. Warner Wallace to our Oster chapter.
Well, thanks for having me. Sarah is the reason why the trip was planned to come in to do Gateway Church and to do your meeting today. And we thought, well, this is going to be great. And I really was hoping that the country would be open by this time when we planned this many months ago. But this is a good second alternative to be able to talk about these issues remotely like this. So you're working with the best streaming platform, Jorge Gil, who's working with the Worldview Media that has set this up today. So I think we're going to be okay. And I think we're going to be able to, well, if there's any technological problems, I can tell you up front, it won't be Jorge or you, John. It'll be on my side of it, okay, just so you know. But I think what we'll try to do is hop in and talk a little bit about some of the evidence for God's existence from that book, God's Crime Scene. But before I start, look, if you're listening and watching this right now, you're part of an organization that already has mastered a lot of the issues that we're going to talk about. I mean, what better organization than Reasons to Believe? And these are all, we were pretty close regionally here in Southern California. And so Fuzz and Hugh are people who I get to hang out with occasionally at conferences and other places. And I lean heavily on their work in order to do some of the things that I do. Remember, my skill set is different than those guys. My skill set is really just investigative. What do we do with the experts and the information that experts give us? And then how do we translate that for jurors? Now, I will tell you, that's what I want to focus on today, is how do we translate information for people who don't necessarily have an interest in the sciences. So as we talk about all these great talks you have coming, I can tell you a lot of the people in my life who might have interest in science fiction really are not going to sit still if we throw the ball a certain way. So although I'm not an expert and a PhD in some of those areas, I do have a lot of experience throwing the ball to jurors. And so what I want to do today is talk to you about the evidence for God from science, a narrow range of science. But I suspect that if you're in this organization, RTB, there's probably almost nothing I'm going to say today that you haven't heard in one form or another from people who are PhD'd in these areas. So what I want to focus on instead is, how do we take that information and translate it in such a way that people go, okay, I get it. And now that issue is resolved for me. And that's really the focus of my work, is how do I take that expert on the stand and then eventually get 12 jurors to decide something. Yeah, I still have open cases. Let's just jump right in. And I'm going to share my presentation with you, and I'm just going to begin, okay? My background is in, I'm basically doing the work that I was doing always, which is investigations. I still have 2 open cases. I wish I could completely step out, but there's 2 cases that I still want to finish, and these cases always take a number of years. If you like Dateline, you've probably seen our work on Dateline. I've been on Dateline more than any other detective in the country, working cold case investigations. Now, cold case investigations are just unsolved murders, and sometimes they're 3-4 decades old. My son is doing the same work that I was doing before him, and my dad is part of this as well. He was at our agency, the same name. We're all named Jim Wallace, and we've been there since 1961. So for nearly 60 years, we've been investigating cases. I've done some of my dad's cases, and I'm afraid that my son will probably end up doing some of mine that aren't solved. So we'll keep on this 3-generation. And I spent some time trying to explain this idea, this approach to working events in the past on a movie that is called God's Crime. It's called God's Not Dead 2. So there they gave me about 6 minutes. That was really narrowly focused on Christian claims, the resurrection primarily. What I want to do today with you is take you through a slightly different process. I'm going to use a book, not my book, God's Crime Scene. I'm going to start with this book. I want to teach you how to be a good investigator. And we're going to start by looking at what I call Death Investigations 101. Believe it or not, I'm going to give you a template, an analogy that I think will help you explain why the evidence is so strong for God's existence without ever opening a page of Scripture. Because for me, at 35, I was still not a Christian. I didn't become, my wife and I were together for about 18 years before either one of us became a Christian. And if you would have approached me to make a case for God's existence back in those days, and you wanted to open your Bible to do it, you were not going to have an active audience. I was done. So I needed to have somebody come at me a slightly different way. I'm going to show you what we do at death scenes and then demonstrate why this might help you to investigate the case for God's existence. In a death scene, we often have people who are dead on the floor, and we don't know why they're dead. We don't know how they died. Not every death scene is a murder scene. So if you've got a dead guy on the floor, what we start to do is we collect evidence. Here we can see clearly that we have something simple. Dead guy laying face down. Okay. Well, how do you explain dead guys laying face down? Well, we make a list of evidence on one side and a list of explanations on the other. So right now we have, as far as evidence goes, we have 2 things. Dead guy laying face down. Now, how do you explain dead guys laying face down? There are 4 ways to explain these guys. 1, he might have died by some natural cause. He could have also died by some accident, or he could have committed suicide. And finally, he may have been killed by somebody else in a homicide. How do we determine the difference? Look, right now, I cannot cross out any of these possible explanations. They all, by the way, the standard I'm looking for, folks, is not, is it possible? Anything, everything is possible. I'm looking for, is it reasonable? The standard of proof in a criminal trial, the highest levels, is not beyond a possible doubt. That's a high standard you would never hit. Instead, it's a lower standard called reasonable doubt. Because anything is possible. It's possible that you're imagining this entire thing. It's possible that none of us are actually real people, that we're all doing this with artificial intelligence, right? It's all been programmed. It looks good, but it's not actually real people. You don't know because you're not here in front of us. That's possible, but is it reasonable? That's the standard. So let's go back to our illustration. As it is right now, I cannot remove any of these possible explanations. If he had a heart attack, he would look like this. If he accidentally took too many pills, he would look like that. If he intentionally took too many pills, he would look like that. If I poisoned him with too many pills, he would look like that. You see how right now, with just a dead guy laying face down, I really cannot cross out any explanation. But what if the scenario was different? What if he's a dead guy laying face down, but he's also in a pool of his own blood, center torso, not around his head, but center torso? And that's a new piece of evidence we have to add to our evidence list. And if we do that, we can start to kind of eliminate some of these possible explanations because they're not as reasonable. Like, where are you going to bleed from center torso? I don't think that's a reasonable explanation. So I can cross out natural death. Is it possible? Yes. But is it reasonable? No. Okay. Can I cross out accidental death? I got to kind of roll them over, don't I, to see what the injury is before I can cross out accidental death. So I can't cross that out yet. So let's go back and change our scenario. What if he's a dead guy laying face down, but now he's got a single gunshot wound to his center back? It's an entry wound. Let's change it. Let's make that start with an exit wound. That'd be even more, I think, interesting, entertaining for us to ponder. So as an exit wound, right, that's coming out of his back, center torso, 1 round's been fired, 1 bullet's been fired. The gun is sitting by his side, right? There's a casing next to the gun. Okay, how do I explain? Let's put that on our evidence list. Okay, now, what can I cross out? It turns out I really can't cross out anything right now because that's an exit wound. In this first iteration, it's an exit wound. So he could have accidentally thought the gun was empty and fired it, and it shot himself. That's an exit wound. So he could be the cause. It could be a suicide. I've seen some pretty bizarre suicides. It also could be a homicide right now. These are still in the game. Let's now twist it a little bit, okay? Let's change it a little bit. Let's go back to our scenario. So now in our scenario, what if we had an additional piece of data? What if next to the gun and next to the body, I actually had a note, a suicide note? It's written in his own handwriting. It's on a piece of paper I can find elsewhere in the room, so it's his paper. It's a pen that I find elsewhere in the room, pens like it, and it's got his fingerprints on the paper. It's got his skin cell transfer DNA on the paper. Okay, if that's the case, I'm going to have to add this additional piece of evidence, which I'll do right now, and I'll put it on my list so you have it on the list. Now let's look at our explanations. Okay, it's pretty clear if there's a suicide note that he didn't, unless he accidentally killed himself before he intended to kill himself, it does appear that he intended to kill him. I can cross out accidental. And a lot of people, though, when I get to this point, they're not quite sure if I can cross out suicide, even though there's a suicide note, because they'll say, well, somebody could have forced him to do that. Somebody could have put a gun to his head. Well, they're going to, okay. You guys all been watching too much TV, right? Too much of these crazy, cop shows, like Criminal Minds, which is a dumb show, by the way. But okay, let's just go ahead and change our scenario a little bit to kind of eliminate that possibility. So let's go back to our scenario. And now let's say, okay, maybe what we have is we have foreign. What if that wasn't his handwriting on the suicide note? What if that weren't those weren't his fingerprints? The skin cell transfer DNA does not come back to him. It's not his paper or pen. We can't find anything like it anywhere else in the house. That would make me suspicious, right? I mean, it's not even in his own handwriting. What if it complicated it a little more? Now he's talking about exit and entry wounds. What if now, instead of being the exit wound we talked about earlier, what if now there were multiple gunshot wounds to his back and they were all entry wounds? What if there was bloody footprints leading out of the room? Well, I'm going to all those details here on the diagram. You can see this is a California murder because you got bare feet going out to the beach there. But the point is, this would change things, don't you think? All this additional evidence, now that we have entry wounds instead of exit wounds, now that we have no DNA from the victim on the note, this is going to change our scenario completely, right? So now it's reasonable to cross out suicide. Kind of hard to shoot yourself multiple times in the back and then walk out of the room in your own blood. It's kind of hard to do. So I can now cross out suicide as a reasonable inference. And the most reasonable inference now is that this is a homicide. And by the way, this is called abductive reasoning. We do this in every death scene. We ask jurors to do this when they are contemplating whether or not the story or the evidence or the explanation offered by a defense team is as credible as the explanation offered by a prosecution team. This is how we do cases. There's also another thing that just happened, and I'm not sure you caught it. And when I teach this principle to investigators, I call this the inside or outside the room principle. And here's what it goes. That's how I voice it. Usually it sounds like this. If you can explain everything that's in the room by staying in the room for an explanation, this is not a murder. Got it? If I can explain the stuff that's in the room by staying in the room for an explanation, this is not a murder. Let me make it clearer. Let's go back to our illustration for a second. Let's imagine our guy there on the ground, okay? But now let's make the room a little clearer visually. Let's make the room a box, and he's in this box, okay? So now he's in the box, and we're going to ask the question: can I explain everything that's in the box or in the room by staying in the room, or is the better explanation outside the room? So, for example, if I said, okay, I see a note, and that note is written on paper that is his paper. I find it elsewhere in the room. It's only his fingerprints. There's nobody else from the outside the room had to be come in the room in order to explain that. So now I can explain the note by staying inside the room. And if I said, well, I asked people and they said, oh yeah, that's his pistol. He's owned that pistol for years. It's registered to him. And he keeps it in a safe in the corner of the room. I can actually stay inside the room to explain the pistol. And anyone can shoot themselves once without any help from anybody else outside the room. I could even explain a single gunshot by staying in the room for an explanation. Now imagine if that was our scenario. Well, then that explanation, that set of explanations by staying in the room, it's going to have to be either a natural, which is not a natural in this case, obviously, an accidental, or a suicide. because he doesn't need any help to do that. And if the door's locked and no one else has been in the room, I got no evidence anyone else has been in the room, this is a good explanation. But what if it changes? What if the better explanation is outside the room? So, for example, that note, there's no other paper like that anywhere in the room. It's not his handwriting. It's not his DNA. It's not his fingerprints. I got to go outside the room now. Who did that? And let's say, for example, I'm looking at the pistol. Oh, people say, oh, it's not his pistol. I mean, that guy's afraid of guns. He would never, ever use a gun. He'd be afraid to use one. So that's not his. And of course, it's not registered to him. And so, okay, now I got to go out and figure out whose pistol is that. And it's awfully hard to shoot yourself multiple times without any help from somebody outside the room. And finally, I have footprints that lead outside the room. So clearly the best explanation is a cause that is outside the room. Now look, when that happens and your better explanation is outside the room, everything shifts to a homicide investigation. You know why? Because you have evidence of an intruder. And intruders change everything. This is really just an intruder investigation. And so you look at that, intruders are the thing that turn death scenes into crime scenes. Once I know I have an intruder, it shifts to crime scene. Also, intruders change your sense of curiosity. You might have a sense of curiosity about why someone would kill themselves or how this could happen. But once you know you've got an intruder, that sense of curiosity needs to shift to a sense of urgency. There's a show, not Criminal Minds. There's a show on TV that does kind of capture what we do, and it's called The First 48. And that's about the first 48 hours of an investigation. You have to be quick. You have to have a sense of urgency, because as this thing time taps out, you will see that you have a less of a chance of solving the case. And that's why cases that I do that are 35 years old are really hard to solve. Intruders change everything. So let's go back to our diagram again for a second. If we shifted this, and the thing we were examining is not a crime scene, not a death scene, but is instead the entire physical universe, the known universe, all space, time, and matter that are impacted by chemistry and physics, that is our scene. Now the question is, there's a bunch of stuff in this room, I'm calling it a room, the room of the natural universe, that I think has to be explained. There's evidence in there. But is the better explanation for the stuff in the room an explanation that's in the room? Or is the better explanation outside of space, time, and matter to explain the stuff that's in the spatial, temporal, and material universe? And I think we have to explain some things, and you probably have talked about these in lots of your meetings. We have a universe that has a beginning that has to be explained. The room itself has a beginning. We also know that it appears to be fine-tuned for the presence of carbon-based life like ours. That's actually not all that controversial a statement. Even atheists would at least admit to the appearance of fine-tuning. Also, we have an origin of life. Life emerges in our universe from inorganic matter. How in the world does that happen? That's still an open area of study. And I don't think the more we learn, the further away we are getting from an answer. And when biology eventually does appear, it appears to be designed. Even, that Dawkins, even Richard Dawkins will say that the entire biological endeavor is actually a pursuit of trying to explain the appearance of design, even though, of course, he would reject that there is a designer. But also, those are the first four things. There's also the appearance of minds. We know we are conscious. We actually experience and think about these things. You're thinking right now, if this makes any sense. But in order to make that thought process occur, are you using your brain, only your brain, or do you have this immaterial reality called consciousness? And if you do, how do we explain that when we are living in a materialistic universe in which everything is a matter of cause and effect? As a matter of fact, if you don't have an immaterial mind, you're also going to have a hard time explaining free agency. But we do experience free agency, but not everyone believes we do. Sam Harris, for example, is a neuroscientist and a pretty, I think, a clever and popular atheist, argues that your mind is an illusion. You have a brain, but the mind is an illusion, and you have a sense of free agency that is not actually accurate. That is also an illusion. You're not as free as you think you are, he would say, because he believes that everything is a matter of dominoes, material dominoes falling, so neurons fire in your brain, causing you to act in certain ways, to respond in certain ways, but you have no control over those neurons or anything that affected the neurons and the long string of dominoes that fall. Finally, we objective moral truths. We would say that it's never okay to torture babies for fun. Heck, we would say it's never okay to kick a dog. I mean, we're getting to the point where we admit to a ton of objective moral truth claims. And the question is, are they really objective claims, or just a matter of personal or cultural consensus? We have to kind of ask ourselves where those come from if they are objective. And finally, we believe there's a standard of righteousness by which we can call something truly evil, not just a personal opinion about evil. We think that some things truly are, and that, of course, requires an objective standard of righteousness by which to measure. So I look at those 8 things, and I ask myself the question, can I explain those 8 things by staying inside the room? Or is the better explanation a source, a cause, that's outside the room? And that's what we're going to do today. I mean, I just kind of took a little while to set this up, but I want you to see that we're going to do an intruder investigation, because if there's an intruder in this room, that intruder spans the entire cosmos. And this is why I wrote this book, God's Crime Scene. I didn't intend, people at my publishing company said, I'm not sure we can call it this. I thought, no, I'm not saying that God's committed a crime. I'm just saying that if we were to examine the universe like a crime scene, we could actually figure out what the best explanation is for the first cause. It's this inside or outside the room template. Now, this is our death scene. That's the evidence on one side, and that is the explanations on the other. Now, we're going to flip this, and we're going to go to the universe. We have 8 pieces of evidence in the universe, and we have 2 ways to explain those 8 pieces. One, we could say, well, there's a set of forces that are inside the room, unguided, naturalistic forces that act on one another and explain all of this. Or we have to jump outside the room for an extra-natural, a supranatural, a supernatural explanation. Which is the best? Now, today, all we're going to do, we've already talked about what we're going to talk about today. John and I were saying we're going to do biological evidence. And I could spend... In our chapter, I really try to deep dive into all the explanations related to biological evidence and related to the origin of life. But for purposes of what I want to do with you, is I want to find a way to show you how to illustrate this for people so they can see clearly why an explanation inside the room doesn't really get it done, and that the best explanation is something outside the room. You know, I had a case a number of years ago in which a murder occurred in our city, and when we got there, the guy was dead, shot in his garage. He was had a shop, auto shop, and in the garage of his auto shop, he was shot, and next to his body was a phone, and the phone had a text, and this text I had never seen before, a text like this, and I kind of wondered, well, is this a message that somebody sent him, somebody named Rachel? Or is this just a butt dial? Is it a mistake? Is it an error the phone created? Is this information, or is it just an artifact? I didn't know, and I didn't recognize it, so I had to do a little bit of investigating. It turned out that Rachel was his wife, and that Rachel wanted him dead because she had been cheating on him for a little over a year, and she had a boyfriend who she was cheating with that she told him, I want my husband dead by the end of the year. Well, it was about 6 days before New Year's Eve when this guy was killed. So this boyfriend was quite a procrastinator, but eventually got over to do the job. Now, interestingly, I did a search warrant on Rachel's phone tolls. And after I did all that, I realized that she would use this kind of nomenclature all the time. She would use this kind of message all the time. For her, this was a message that her husband, the one who's now dead, understood. And as a matter of fact, she texted this to him before he was killed, because he called her and said, hey, it's the holidays and no one's coming in. I'm going to come home early. Well, she knew her boyfriend was on his way to kill her husband, and she did not want her husband to come home early and leave the garage, because then her boyfriend would miss him. So she texted him this message, which in her kind of vocabulary with her husband meant, I will be there in 30 minutes. So she told her husband that she was coming to the garage and would be there in 30 minutes. And so because of that, her husband did not move. He stayed in place. And 15 minutes later, he was killed by the boyfriend. By determining that this is not just an artifact, is not random, is not a butt dial, by determining that this was actually information, we had a good place to start interviewing. I want to know, why is Rachel sending this information to her husband? It turns out that the mystery of how life originates in the universe is very much the same, driven by a similar mechanism. It's driven by information. Now I'm going to show it to you. You already know what I'm talking about, I think. You already know that I'm talking about DNA. And I'm talking about this sequence of information that is in the genome. It turns out that we used to think that perhaps life was based entirely on the issue related to physics and chemistry acting on space, time, and matter. But it turns out the secret, the mystery about how life begins is grounded in information, because in that genome, we have a series of nucleotides that are informative. They instruct. As a matter of fact, I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Stephen C. Meyer, who presents the problem. Look, information comes from one source based on our common experience. It comes from minds. And if there's not a single example anywhere in the history of science or the history of the universe in which we can show that information comes from physics or chemistry or chance. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, hold on, Jim. Well, look, when I hear this, as an atheist, I would have said one of two things. I would have said, well, number one, if that's the case, you're wrong. And we just haven't figured out how physics and chemistry can produce information. Or two, you're wrong, and that's not really information. One of those two things has got to be wrong, because I've got information in the genome, and if you think the only way you can get that is from intelligent minds, and that's our only experience. By the way, I would say that the burden of proof to get this from physics and chemistry is on the person who believes you can get this from physics and chemistry. You can simply say, well, show me how physics and chemistry can give you information. Now, you will sometimes hear them say, well, it can give you some kinds of Shannon information, some forms of information that are relatively simplistic. Well, that's why I want to introduce you to the work of somebody who I think will help us determine if that is actually a good explanation or not. And that is a writer who's written, and there's a book out there. His name is Dr. Werner Gitt. And I will tell you, this is a book that is really steeped in mathematical formula, information theory, and it's not an easy read. This is one of those areas where we're going to have to do some translating of the details to show people why the best explanation for information in DNA is actually a mind, an intelligent mind. So what I'm going to do in order to do that with you is I'm going to introduce you to my dog Bailey, who I'm surprised is actually not barking right now, because usually she'd be barking in the background. Bailey is a corgi. If you like our kids' books, our kids' book, Bailey, is in the third book, Forensic Faith for Kids. I do introduce the dog and do a lot of drawings of the dog. But Bailey is a smart dog, but I wouldn't say she's exceptionally smart. If I gave her a typewriter, for example, and I said, hey, go ahead and type out a message, I don't think the first message would be all that great. I'll go ahead and write it on the chalkboard, what she types out, and her first effort looks like this. Okay. What does that even mean? That looks like something a dog with a really short, I don't even think that corgis have elbows. Okay, they just have this. The point is, tell me how in the world a corgi is going to type out anything. So I think if you saw that, you would say, okay, now is that information? Yeah, in a sense, it is information. In the sense that it is specific, or not specific, it's complex, I should say. In the sense that if I asked her to do this twice and she banged out the exact same sequence, you go, whoa, that's impressive. Because the complexity seems like it'd be hard to repeat twice, right? But it's not specific in the sense that I don't see words that I recognize. So it lacks specificity, but it does have complexity. So this is a form of information, but it is the absolute lowest form of information. And Werner Gitt would call this, by the way, if Bailey could bang out patterns, that would be even more impressive. Would you agree? If she could just do TT spacebar, TT spacebar, or even a more involved pattern, like T13T, you would say, wow, okay, that's a smart dog. But what is she saying? What is she saying in any of these? I don't know. Again, these have complexity, but they lack understandable specificity. And this is the lowest level of information according to Werner Gitt. This is information that he calls statistics. Not in the same way you and I might use that word statistics. He calls this the first level of information. Can you get this from space, time, and matter acted upon by physics and chemistry? Yeah. Yeah, the first line you can get just a random chance. And there are certain attractions, physical attractions, that will cause, for example, like crystalline patterns that are actually, if you make those numerical, if you translate those into numbers, you would see there's repeating numerical patterns. So this actually, you could get this from physics and chemistry. And if this is all DNA is, well, then you don't need a mind to explain it, because this is you can get this physics, but this is not what DNA is. This is the lowest level of information. You can get this with physics and chemistry, but it's not DNA. What if Bailey could type out this sentence? That's better. That's much better. Now, is there some specificity here? I have some words I can actually identify. There's complexity and specificity, but I still don't understand what she's trying to say. It's like she lacks the ability to organize these specific words into a way. Now, this is the second level of information, and this is called cosyntax. By the way, we now are outside the room for an explanation. That first level, statistics, you can get that inside the room with just physics and chemistry. But this cosyntax, where you actually can code and decode words that I recognize, this forces, you can't get that with physics and chemistry. You're already one level outside the room to get this. And we're not at DNA yet. That's not what DNA is. And we're not even close to DNA. But you're already outside the room. Okay, what if Bailey could type a sentence in which she also understands the specific use of words, but can actually put them in order to form sentences. So she types out this sentence. Not bad. I actually know what she's trying to tell me. Grandpa's eating. This is another level of information, and it is called, according to Werner Gitt, semantics. Now, this, I've known people who were stuck between 2 and 3. I was you probably studied language, and if you in your first year of language, if you try to form a sentence, you sound like an idiot, right? Because you've got the words down, but you're not quite sure how to to form the words into sentences, how to form verbs, what verbs are you mess it up. As a matter of fact, I remember I was in a restaurant in Malibu, California. And it was a Thai food restaurant. I went into the washroom, and this is the sign that was in the washroom, okay, in a Malibu, California restaurant, okay. Now, again, I think this person who wrote it stuck somewhere between 2 and 3 here. So here's the sign that I had. Please do not throw paper wiping hand down toilet. Now, I think I understand what he wants me. Whatever you're using to wipe your hands, don't throw that down the toilet. I get it, but can you see how he's kind of stuck between a 2 and a 3? Let's go back to our list of dog sentences. By the way, we are still not at what DNA does, and we are now 2 steps outside the room in terms of information, and we're not yet at DNA. What if Bailey could type out a sentence that was really so complex it actually tells us it's a request? It's a request for action. Grandpa, you're sitting there and you're eating. Let's feed me. It's a request for Grandpa to do something. Well, that's a whole other level of information. That's called pragmatics. And by the way, if there's an expectation that Grandpa will actually get up and feed Bailey, well, that expectation, in other words, I'm making a request with the expectation that you will meet this, because what I really want is the walk that occurs after you feed me every day. Well, okay, I'm now making a request with an expectation of getting the next domino to fall, and that's why I made the request to be. That's called apobetics. And this is the highest level of information. And now we are finally at DNA. Now, one way to determine if something is complex or simple, take a look at our sentences again. The top sentence is simple in the sense that I can't even tell you what it means. The bottom sentence, I do know what it means. The top sentence is so simple and lacks information that I could remove a character. I could remove, for example, this character, and it does nothing to change meaning. That's how, when you've got simple strands of lowest level of information, there's no meaning to begin with, so I can take a character out and it doesn't change meaning. Look at the bottom sentence, though. I think you already know where I'm going with this. This is why we say that commas save lives, right? That sentence, if I take out just one character, the same character, it's going to change everything. Now, sweet Bailey who wants to get fed is now evil Bailey who wants to eat Grandpa because I've removed one small character in the sequence. This is what happens with complex, high-level information. Small changes will actually impact meaning. Now, I show this to you because something similar is happening in DNA. So here's, I think this is Billy the Kid or Jesse James. I'm not sure which one it is, but let's say this is his wanted poster. He is constructed on the basis of information. Now, his genome would not be this long. It would be, off for miles in one direction and off for miles in the other direction. But I just wanted you to get some sense of what the nucleotides would line up at some point in his genome. And these things are not just random. As a matter of fact, just like with the sentence I showed you a minute ago, if you start to change characters like this one and take it out and change it, well, that one would change everything. I mean, now, are there some autocorrection within DNA? Of course there are. There are some, but that's an amazing set of principles itself that is hard to explain as well. But if you change, there are genetic therapies that we do. My son, who's an anesthesiologist, he was a biochemist before. I have two sons. One's a cop and one's a doctor. The doctor, Dr. David, he also will tell you that he did genetic therapies in order to try to cure cancer and tumors in kidneys. And they were simply changing the genome sequence in the kidneys in order to cure the cancer. There are genetic therapies because he knows, like I know, that if you change that sequence, take a look at Jesse or Billy here, something's going to change. His forehead height, his nose length, his ears. There will be a structural consequence for changing the sequence of information in the genome. And that's how we can also test it. This is why we know that this is the highest level of information. And you are several levels outside of what the room can get you. And that's why people who have studied this, people like, for example, Paul Davies, who's not a believer, I think he would still call himself an agnostic. He says from Arizona State University that we're left with the mystery of where biological information comes from. If the normal laws of physics can't inject information, and he knows they can't, and if we're willing to rule out miracles, and he does because he's not a believer, then how can life be predetermined and inevitable rather than a freak accident? How did we generate this random complexity and specificity together? Remember, it's not just complexity, it's complexity and specificity that create information. He says we always come back to that basic paradox, and I think he's right. As a matter of fact, there was a much more committed atheist than even I was, and he was a studied atheist of the 20th century. His name is Antony Flew. And Antony Flew was an analytic and evidentialist philosopher. He was somebody who had written a bunch of books and debated a bunch of people, including William Lane Craig, on issues such as this. He was also somebody who, in his younger years, was familiar with the people who were friends of C.S. Lewis. He signed on to the Humanist Manifesto. And this is a guy who wrote a bunch of books, but at the end of his life, he wrote a book that might surprise you. He changed his mind. And he wrote a book that says there is a God, how the world's most notorious atheist changed his mind. And what was one of the primary reasons why he changed his mind? Well, it all came down to this issue of DNA. I now believe in a God. I now think that the evidence does point to a creative intelligence almost entirely because of the DNA investigations. What I think the DNA material has done is that it has shown by the almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements which are needed to produce life, that intelligence must have been involved in getting these extraordinarily diverse elements to work together. Let me give it to you, if you get nothing else out of this, let me just give it to you in one illustration that I think makes the difference. Remember how we talked about our room where we walked in and there was a guy lying on the room and he was dead, but we weren't quite sure what the cause of death was. Well, imagine if this was the wall next to his body and you've got some blood spatter on that wall. Well, what caused that blood spatter? To be honest, that doesn't tell you much about whether it's a murder, because I could accidentally fall in a particular way, hit my head on something, and then this blood spatter will simply be the consequence of physics and chemistry. The physics and trajectory of blood being cast. Now, by the way, I had to study this stuff like crazy when I was first an investigator. They sent us to a school in Sacramento, California, where all we did for 3 days was smack things that were bloody to see what the spatter would do. So we could calculate, well, where was he standing when he was hit? Where was the cast off from the knife on the ceiling? We're constantly looking at blood spatter. So here, I could explain this blood spatter by just physics and chemistry. And I really wouldn't be able to tell if this is a murder or a suicide or an accidental, because I could hit the ground in such a way that just your blood chemistry, the physics of and the chemistry of the blood and how it dries, how it drips, the kind of weight it casts with, all of those things could be explained by physics and chemistry. But same picture now. Let's change it slightly. What if we walked into this room and instead of having that blood spatter like that, there was on the wall written, "You deserved it." Don't tell me we're not shifting this toward a homicide investigation. Of course we are. Because even if the other blood spatter on that wall can be explained with physics, that message can't be explained with physics. That message came from the mind of somebody who probably is involved in this murder. That's what information does, is once you know you can't explain it with physics and chemistry, tell me why we wouldn't shift to mind. How much time do you think you would spend in this crime scene trying to maneuver around and twist things so you can somehow explain it without the presence of mind? Why in the world would we try to do that with DNA? This is the dilemma we face. And I think it's that clear. Now, back to our room. How do we stay in that room for this? Well, there's only a couple of ways you can do this. One, you have to say that it's some chance. Chance causes the information, but that does not solve chicken and egg problems. And I don't think anyone thinks that chance is going to create the kind of complex and specific information we see in DNA. But even if it could, even if just somehow it's an unbelievable odds, and we've somehow overcome those odds, that would not explain the chicken and egg problems we have in biology. So, for example, we know that amino acids are formed into proteins to form the basic building blocks of life under the direction of DNA. But if it wasn't the case, how in the world would you explain, for example, that amino acids are assembled into proteins in a machine in your body called the ribosome? But the ribosome machine is built from proteins. There's the problem. You can't get a protein without the machine. You can't get the machine without the protein. You got a chicken and egg problem. There's tons of these in biology. The other way you might describe this, though, is to say, well, no, this is a matter of law. There was a choice. Physics and chemistry bring us to this point. Physics and chemistry will inevitably bring us to information in DNA. And if that is your claim, what is your evidence for that claim? That burden is on you. And good luck with that. The more we discover about the complexity of DNA, the less I think it is supported by a claim that you can get there with just physics and chemistry. Of course, there is another way we could explain DNA. It may simply be the message that we think it is. A message that is actually directive, that has expectations that expect to be met. And once those expectations are met, the DNA instructs the process to stop. So when these machines are being built in your body, these micromolecular machines, they are formed by the information in DNA. And once they are completely formed, it stops because it has already reached its goal. This all looks like evidence of messaging from a mind. But that means you've got to jump outside the room for an explanation. And that's why I think it's a good explanation. Now, we talk about, these are the questions that we typically ask in any investigation, the classic investigative questions, the what, where, why, when, how. I see scientists ask all of these about DNA, but they don't ask the last investigative question. These aren't all, these are just 5 investigative questions. There are 6. They don't ask the 6th question. In doing science, they only ask the first 5. What's the 6th question? Well, here it is. The 6th question is a who question. Oh, no, we can't ask who questions. We got to ask those, but we can't ask the who. Well, why? What if the evidence points to a who? There are no who's in science, Jim. There are no who's, no forces that are personal. There are no beings. There are no who's. Yeah, but if I walk in the room and I see you deserved it on the wall, am I not allowed to ask the who question? It sure seems to me like there's a who involved. Don't care. Science has been, I think we can go back to the way science was done during the scientific revolution, which was dominated by Christians who were not afraid to ask the 6th question. And that was a scientific explosion, a revolution in science, even though people were asking all 6 questions. It's not as though we are going to somehow limit science by asking all 6. I'm not going to jump to God did it when I could see that there may be some physical process, part of God's universe, that could explain it. But I should be allowed, it seems to me, to ask a who question if all the evidence points, it's not a God of the gaps. I'm not jumping there because I can't explain the origin of life. I'm jumping there because I've got a message written on the wall. And it seems to me that's the most reasonable inference. That's why I think I should be allowed to ask the who question. Now, most people, though, who are doing science will try to rule that out. Werner Gitt puts it this way, and I think he's correct when he says it this way. He says, a necessary requirement for generating meaningful information is the ability to select from alternatives. When you're writing a paper, you select the words you want to use. That means you need a mind that can say, not that word, this word, not that letter, this letter. And that requires an intelligent volitional entity. Unguided, random processes cannot do this. Not in any amount of time. You can give all the time you want. It's not going to happen because the selection process requires continual guidance, selections, choices continually. And that is done by intelligent beings that have a purpose. Now, that, I think, is the dilemma you have when trying to explain the origin of life. Let's go to a suspect profile quickly, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Look, in the end, I always can draw up a suspect profile. Now, I think the better explanation is a suspect that is intelligent and communicative that is outside of time. Let's look back to our room one more time. this inside or outside the room model I'm proposing provides us with information about a potential intruder. And that's what we're looking at here. Do we have an intruder? And that, I said before, that should turn your sense of curiosity into a sense of urgency. And that's what I would hope that when we talk to our friends, we could help them see that now is the time to make a choice, to make a decision, to render a verdict about whether or not God exists, about whether or not Christianity is true. When I go back to my 8 evidences, I actually think that the far better explanation for these 8 evidences is a cause outside of space, time, or matter. And that's why I'm a believer. But by the way, I can make that case without ever opening up scripture. I think we can make that case from the sciences. Now, what does that God or that being look like? What does that thing outside of space, time, and matter look like? I always say it this way. I know pretty much what I'm looking for and what that guy or gal is going to be like before I ever meet my suspect, because I can basically sketch out a suspect profile from the evidence at the scene. And I've got evidence at the scene here. And I can actually start to sketch out what my suspect profile should look like. Because each piece of evidence requires a specific kind of suspect. So let's go back to our list of 8, our diagram of 8. In order to get a universe that has a being, by the way, it's not going to be like Mick Jagger, because Mick Jagger cannot explain these things. Okay, sorry. I need somebody who's outside of space, time, and matter, and can be the cause of all space, time, and matter, that is directed and purposeful, that actually is fine-tuning a universe, that is the source of information in the DNA that begins life, and then is the designer behind the appearance of design and biology, that is the mind that creates beings in its image, which is why we have minds, and acts freely to create, which is why we act freely to create, and is the source of all objective moral truth that sits outside of space, time, and matter, by which we judge anything and call it evil. Okay, that is not Mick. Okay, he cannot get those things done. But that does describe, if I'm looking for something that fits those descriptions, that does sound an awful lot like classic theism and Christian theism. Because this is what God would, we always say that God does all these things. This is who God is. And you could arrive at this theological view of God, not from your Bible, or not from scripture, or even from theological thinking. You could arrive at this view of God from science. So let's go back now and take a look at a suspect I had in the case years ago who murdered a woman. And we made the case with 4 kinds of evidence. First, we did have some eyewitness observations. We did have some of his behaviors that were kind of strange and made it pretty obvious that he was involved in a murder. We had some physical evidence of the murder. And finally, we had statements that he made. Now, these are 4 very different kinds of evidence in 4 very different categories. I'm going to have to bring in experts in 4 different categories. And if all of your experts who don't know anything, my eyewitness guy doesn't know anything about behaviors, my behavior guy doesn't know anything about the forensic evidence, my forensic guy doesn't know anything about statement evidence. These are 4 different kinds of experts. If all of them point to the same reasonable inference, that's probably a good inference. Same thing happens here. We've got a being in view. There are 4 categories of evidence. 2 of these are cosmological. 2 of them are biological. 2 of them are mental, and 2 of them are moral. These are very different experts: astrophysics on one side, cosmologists, biochemists, biologists. You've got people who are in ethics or who are in neuroscience. You've got philosophers in the 4th category. If all 4 types of experts point to the same being for an explanation, you probably got a pretty good explanation. Now, let me show you how this looks in criminal trials, okay? In criminal trials, you'll get these explanations offered. The defense team will come in and say, oh, yeah, but I can explain. I've got alternative explanations for how the universe could come into existence. I've got alternative explanations for evidence piece number 2. I've got 3 experts who can tell you how to describe it. Yeah, but guess what? These folks, these experts who are trying to offer explanations of these 8 pieces of evidence, they don't agree with each other. If you're somebody who thinks that got one theory about the cosmos, you think everyone else's other theory is wrong. Well, it turns out, why do you have so many explanations that don't agree with each other? And by the way, not just that, whatever it is you're trying to use to describe or explain the beginning of the universe, that's not an explanation that's being offered for the existence of moral truth. It turns out that's an entirely different category. These things have to happen by accident together, because whatever's causing the universe to appear will not explain the appearance of design and biology or minds or this moral issue over here. Now, there's another way to explain the same 8 pieces of evidence. It might just be that there is one common causal factor that would explain all of these 8 pieces and even unify them. So the question becomes, which of these 2 is more reasonable as an explanation? Dozens and dozens of unrelated random explanations that have no correlation to one another, or the one explanation that unifies the entire set. So what I typically like to say is that we've been looking for a theory of everything in physics. Well, it turns out there is a theory of everything. The theory of everything is called God. And that turns out that that one theory does explain everything in physics, everything in neurology, everything in ethics, everything in biology, everything in astrophysics. Look, I talk about this in books. I've written, I'm working on book number 8 right now. I've written a trilogy of apologetics books, including the one that we talked about today, which is the second one, which is God's Crime Scene. And all these books also have children's versions wrote for 8 to 12-year-olds. And there's an academy called Casemakers Academy where you can actually do online courses and earn a certificate for kids. But I also have a website, which is just coldcasechristianity.com, and we have a phone app there. I answer questions every morning on the phone app. That's the first thing I do, so it's a great place to ask questions going forward. And if you missed anything today, here's how you are going to get it, okay? You're going to text me. Oh, by the way, I'm on all the social media platforms as well. You're going to text me, and you're going to text me with the number that I did not pick. It was assigned to me, so do not make fun of my number. But you're going to text the word detective to a number which has got a lot of 6s in it for a Christian. I get that, 66866, but it's memorable. You're going to text the number 66866, and you're going to text one word, the word detective, to 66866. And if you'll text the word detective, I will send you a link to the entire talk on God's Crime Scene, including the other 7 pieces of evidence we didn't talk about today. And you'll get that right away. You'll get it as soon as you text. You'll get a link. So just copy the link, send it to yourself in an email, and you can open it on your desktop or on your laptop. I know it's not hard to watch things on phones. But that being said, now I think it's a good time for us to hop in and handle any questions that might appear that you might have related to this or anything else.
That was really outstanding. I enjoyed that very much. And I'm particularly impressed at how amazing you were speaking to the laptop. It is so much easier to talk to an audience as someone who gives a.
Oh yeah, I know. What's happened is we've all started adjusted, right? Because of the coronavirus, we've all learned how to communicate this way, and a lot of times, I do a lot of international things too, where I can't get over there, or they can't bring me over. So we do a lot of these kinds of things. So I've now done, I don't know how many of these by way of. Also, I think this is important, John. We're in a generation right now that Gen Z, that are digital natives. It's always been said this about Gen Z, that this is the generation that is, you and I, we are digital immigrants. We adopted this technology of our phones later in life. But if you're a 14-year-old, you don't remember a time before there was a phone, before all of the world's information was available to you and made visual. Digital natives are visual natives. And that means that we've got to be able to communicate visually to a group that, for the most part, has got a ton of visual options. And by the way, you can make those. It doesn't seem like sometimes visual things seem persuasive, and we have to, I think, to reclaim. This is why Jesus spoke in parables, word pictures. He didn't have to. He could just speak like systematic theology every time he opened his mouth. He didn't do that. He created word pictures so that I could imagine myself in that field. I could imagine myself in these scenarios. And I think we need to reclaim visual media for the Christian community.
And those parables were very memorable too. Yeah, very effective. Yeah. So, Jorge, if you could, I still have my slide up with the email for the questions. So if you could put that up so that it's visible and everybody will know where to send in their questions. I do have a handful that we can go through here in just the beginning.
Yeah, and we don't have to be limited to what we're doing in this presentation. I'm willing to entertain any of these questions.
And I don't know if you can put Jim's picture back up beside that, but that'd be a good way to move forward if you can continue to